Welcome to Prevention of Musculoskeletal Disorders, the Need for Change. We're glad you're here. My name is Angie Hunt, Project Manager with the Work Wellness and Disability Prevention Institute, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. This webinar is made possible through the support of the Community Gaming Grant Program to the BC Government, as well as donations and memberships to WWDPI. We thank our program partners, Payne BC, Education Advisory Committee, and speakers who contribute to this webinar series. While we're waiting for others to join us, I'll go over a few technical points for the webinar. You should be able to hear the presentation through your computer speakers or call line if you dialed in. Please use the question box to submit any issues you may be experiencing and to ask any questions you have related to the presentation. We will collect questions submitted throughout the presentation and follow the presentation with a Q&A based on the questions submitted. Following the webinar, any questions not answered in the allotted time will be answered and distributed after the event. The presentation will be recorded and posted for free on our website within a week, along with the slides. You'll be emailed the direct links for all these items when they're available. As I mentioned, my name is Angie, and I'll be moderating the webinar and Q&A session. Our presenter today is Dr. Jodi Oakman. Jodi Oakman is an associate professor at the Center for Ergonomics and Human Factors at Trobe University. She is the head of Department for Public Health. Her background is a mix of industry and academia. Jodi has worked extensively in industries across a range of sectors, including health, manufacturing, and logistics. Her PhD focused on the aging workforce and the impact of organizations on their employees' retirement intentions. Her research is currently focused on the impact of the psychosocial work environment on musculoskeletal disorders and strategies to improve risk management in the workplace. She has several higher degree students researching in this area. And now I'll hand it over to Jodi.
Thank you. I'll apologise for my slightly husky voice. It's not what I normally sound like. As Angie said, I'm over here in Melbourne, Australia, and I started work as a clinician and then went on to do my PhD. But what interests me really is the influence of the work environment on a whole range of health outcomes. And in this particular instance, I'm going to talk about musculoskeletal disorders. I really have a strong interest in using evidence to drive practice and workplace interventions. And I'm going to talk about this today and some of the issues with this translation of research to evidence, because I think this is really where we need to challenge what we're doing in workplaces. My pathway as a clinician to consultant to academic, I think helps give me a pretty good insight into what's needed to change. But what needs to happen at a workplace level is that we need to get information out in a way that can be taken up by workplaces. So what I'm going to do today is to convince you that we need a different approach with regard to the risk management of MSDs. And I'm sure many of you won't need much convincing because you're actually here. But we have tried the same thing for a long time in regard to reducing MSDs. And our progress, certainly here in Australia and is not dissimilar in other countries such as yours, has been limited. So there's a really extensive evidence base which supports the need for change, and it's time that we actually use this evidence in practice. MSDs are the largest OHS problem, and they've been the largest problem for a long time. What happens in workplaces, and I'm really focusing today on workplace musculoskeletal disorders, but there are applications outside of that, is that we tend to focus on the endpoint when someone's had an injury rather than looking further upstream at what are the causal factors. And so this means we miss many opportunities for prevention because we have such a long lead time. Our approach, and this is challenging for me to say, I'm actually an ergonomist, and so I take a very systems approach to prevention problems, but our approach to managing musculoskeletal disorders is in general not systematic. So why are there gaps in musculoskeletal disorder management? There are two key gaps, and the first one is around the psychosocial hazards and this substantial impact they have on musculoskeletal risk, but our current practices do not adequately address the risk from psychosocial hazards. And the second one is that MSD risk management practices in which workers themselves participate are more likely to be effective in reducing risk. But we tend to step away from those and not engage with the worker as much as we should or could. So, what are they? There are many clinical diagnoses for musculoskeletal disorders. So, and they impact all of those things you can see there: tendons, tendon sheaths, muscles, nerves, bursae, blood vessels. One of the things we know is that the diagnoses, sorry about that. We've got some random bug that is, apologies there. One of the things we know is that the diagnoses, the reliability of the diagnoses is often poor. We place a lot of emphasis on diagnoses rather than actually looking at what's happening upstream. One of the things with musculoskeletal disorders is that many of them result from exposure over time. So there are multiple opportunities for things to influence that particular outcome, the musculoskeletal disorder. And in workplaces, this is where we need to focus. So on all of that time we have up until people report an injury, we know in workplaces that there are many reasons why people either report or do not. And those of you who are working in the space that deals with reported injuries will know this. And so there are many triggers. And what we want to do is to try and focus on all of those things up to that point. Once people report and enter compensation, and you'll have things around compensation that are different, but there are many similarities. But we don't want people to enter that compensation system if we can prevent it. So there is some strange bug happening. I'm not sure what that is. The same one that's impacting my voice. So there are many things, there are many different pathways to the development of a musculoskeletal disorder. And we know that actually by the time someone presents with something, it's often the straw that breaks the camel's back, hence the photo there. And so we need to shift our focus more upstream is the key message here, to identify what are those key factors and make sure that we're focusing on the whole work environment, not just the traditional physical factors. And I'll come to more of that in a moment. So we know, we know that there are many, work is changing very rapidly. And we're doing things in very different ways that we did. The fact that I'm talking to you across, software from the other side of the world, there are many things like that that enable us to work differently, work away from our offices, how we work, the sorts of work, and that will continue to change. And that creates a whole lot of challenges with how we address those things. And that doesn't mean that we should throw everything out and say we need to focus on the new ways we're working, but it means we need to adapt the sorts of things we do to identify issues in the work environment and how we might manage those. So there's a question here about, with increasing automation and less physically demanding work, does this mean that MSDs are decreasing? Now, apologies, this is Australian data, but I would suggest, I have looked at Canadian data before, that the situation is not dissimilar. and with other countries around the world, is that our frequency rates of what we call serious musculoskeletal claims and serious claims is slightly declining. We can see there that there is a decline over the period, the last 15 or so years. But what we're seeing is that the percentage of claims that involved MSDs has relatively plateaued. So that means we're decreasing our number of serious claims, but actually those that involve musculoskeletal disorders, we're pretty much flatlining. And so this is the premise of what I'm saying, is that we need to actually think about doing something differently. And what might that look like? And I won't dwell on these. I realise these are Australian data, but the issue is the same. We do tend to see, unfortunately, an increasing frequency rate of MSD claims as people age, and that is critically important for all of us to consider, because we are going to all need to work for longer and manage people in the workplace who will be working longer than perhaps they expected to, but working for longer of later years than what we've been accustomed to. So this will require us to think about how we're actually going to manage to have people in the workforce for much longer periods than we have been used to. So that is a challenge that we're going to need to manage. So just to look at how many older people are working, we can see there, this is OECD data, employment rate by age group, and we can see there that Canada and Australia are nicely nestled in there in the middle there, with about the same employment rate by age group, and we'll see that will shift upwards. We can see our northern European counterparts and New Zealand, interestingly, with much higher participation rates of older workers. So I would expect that will need to shift, and along with that, we'll need to think about how we're actually going to, accommodate that and enable people to work in workplaces with appropriate match. We are seeing, I don't know what's happening here. We are seeing an increasing percentage of older workers compared to younger workers, and that is replicated across most OECD countries. So, what do we need to do? We must ensure that we have a workplace that is able to sustain a longer career, and importantly, that people want to remain employed. So maintaining levels of job satisfaction is important, and I think that will require us to think more creatively about how we actually structure work and the design of work. There will be some shifts in employee and employer relationships, and of course this will require us thinking using a systems method of thinking, because there are multiple things will impact those relationships, including demand and skills demands, but we are going to see a shift in how those relationships work. We will need to see a greater focus on injury reduction, improved job design, and maximising individual workability, so that we're enabling people to be able to work. And along with that, we'll need to accurately identify all the relevant hazards associated with MSD risk. So in terms of thinking about what are the impacts, coming to those work-related factors and individual factors that impact the development of musculoskeletal disorders, this is a model that we used, which underpins much of our research program here at La Trobe University. And so we look at physical factors, the organisational factors, the psychosocial context, and how this matches or doesn't match with individuals, work-related and individual factors of which we have not much control of. We do have control over skills. We can provide people with skills, but we can't control, we don't have much control over physical conditioning, age, and gender, or other genetic vulnerabilities, personality types. So we do need to focus on what we can actually do in a workplace. But we know that these two things, when we have poor match, can impact the individual. And what we see there is that there are two pathways to the development of musculoskeletal disorder. Both the physical pathway, the one that we're mostly comfortable with, that involves high loads, high forces, pushing, pulling, those sorts of things. And then there's the other pathway, which is the stress response pathway. So this is the physiological changes that happen and result in the development of a physical presentation, such as a musculoskeletal disorder. That pathway is much less well understood, despite there being a substantial evidence base. And so that is a real challenge for us to manage in workplaces, that it's not only about what someone is physically doing, it's about a whole range of other factors that influence that development of musculoskeletal disorders. Now, this model, many of you may be familiar with this, was developed in 2001 out of the US from an extensive review expert panel. And you'll see that I've just grouped those to say, well, okay, to really highlight the point that this is not new. We have known about this pathway through psychosocial factors for a long time. And in fact, I could present many more models, some from 1995, which I won't today, but this is not new knowledge, but we are clearly having some challenges about translating this into practice. Now, again, I don't need to talk this through, but these two pathways to the development of musculoskeletal disorders are really important that we understand and then respond to. So, manual handling hazards are task specific. So they're attached to the particular task that the person is doing. The organisation, the psychosocial hazards, two groups. One is the organisational hazards, so the work organisation, the design of the actual job. And then there's a whole bunch of hazards that we could think about as social context. So these are the support, communications, relationships with managers. So even though there is this evidence base, there is still a tendency for what's important is that many of these can interact or are additive. So it's not usual that we have one or the other. It's that they act together. But there is still some resistance to the belief of importance of psychosocial hazards. They can tend to be somewhat dismissed. So I'm going to provide you with a bit more evidence to convince you that you need to think about those. So just to be clear about what these psychosocial hazards are, organisational and the social context, organisational around those job design things, how work is structured, the working hours, the workloads of people, how much control people have, the pace of the work, conflict in work demands, how do I make choices about what I do? And the social context is those communication ones, the culture of the workplace, the value that people that people feel. Now, what's really important here is that the organisational hazards are the responsibility of managers and supervisors, so that they arise from how the job is organised and designed. But what's so these can be both caused by managers and supervisors, but also resolved. So there's a conflict here. But one of the challenges is about important role of these managers and supervisors and their understanding of how critical they are in that shall we say, hazard prevention process. And I think that's a really clear gap where we need to focus is on providing these individuals who have very challenging roles. You know, they're often squashed between reporting upwards and people reporting to them. So they really can be, you know, in the middle of the sandwich, so to speak. So really important to make sure that they're well across what their role is and how they might be influential in developing some of the controls to address these hazards. Lots of evidence. Just point you to a couple of papers that are really provide some really nice, clear outcomes because they're large, or in this case, it's around a very, you know, retail material handlers. What they did was actually looked at all the risk factors for new back pain, and we can see there out of those half a dozen or 8 psychosocial hazards that job intensity and scheduling demands and job dissatisfaction were much higher predictors of new predictors of new back pain compared to lifting, you know, a physical load. In a review which actually looked at a whole range of studies and drew all the evidence together and did a statistical analysis to look at what the impact of psychosocial factors on musculoskeletal disorder development, that is the likelihood of developing new back pain. And again, we see this demands issue and social support being the highest predictors. Now, this didn't look, just to clarify that, this didn't look at physical factors. It was only looking at the psychosocial factors. We can see there that, you know, a contribution there from the psychosocial hazards to the development of low back pain. So what is happening in the real world? Because that's what matters in terms of practice. And one of the challenges we have is that there's very little published evidence of actual practices. There's still a strong focus on physical hazards. And so in a couple of studies that we've done here out of my group at La Trobe, is we've actually looked at policies and procedures in some workplaces to see what they actually say. Now, we know that policies and procedures aren't the be-all and end-all, but they give us a little insight into what people are going to respond to, because we know that organisations that are not performing particularly well in terms of health and safety will do what they need to do to get past accreditation or meet whatever regulatory standards, but they won't do much more than that. So we looked at policies and procedures in aged care and in a couple of other industries as well. But what we found was that there was very much a focus on the physical aspects of work. And so very little guidance on either identification of psychosocial hazards, and then almost nothing on what to do about that. And where there was mention of psychosocial hazards, it was really only in the context of bullying and harassment. One of the other challenges was the lack of involvement of individuals in the workplace in participation, and I'll come back to that in a moment to explore that a bit further. And so there were some real gaps. The other key finding was that a lot of focus is on trying to fix an individual in terms of mental health and well-being, rather than actually address some of the job design, organisational issues that may be influencing a person's behaviour. And so there were some real challenges. Now there's again, there is a large gap here in actually finding out what is happening in practice in workplaces, because they don't tend to publish what they're doing in terms of risk management. Now, we know that worker participation in risk management is really important, and it refers to any process which enables workers to exert influence of their work or working conditions. Importantly, it involves it includes involving them in the identification of hazards, the extent of exposure and development of risk controls. And this is really important because they often know what are the issues, and they've often got a good idea about what could be done. And there are a number of ways to enable participation through surveys, toolbox meetings, workshops, for example. Surveying workers, asking them what they think about things. There is a resistance to do this, and I hear this often when I'm talking to workplaces about, well, if we ask them, we might not be able to do anything about it. And so that's an interesting conundrum, because it's true, and I don't think that one should survey workers unless you're prepared to do something about that. But certainly in our country, ignorance is no excuse. The regulator will not give people a leave pass because they failed to identify what was an issue. That is, they failed to ask about an issue. So it is interesting talking about people have a fear about asking about psychosocial hazards because they don't necessarily feel well equipped to do something about it. And I think that is fair. There are some challenges, but I think we can learn. Now, there are some evidence and some very good reports around to support the links between worker participation and positive outcomes in musculoskeletal disorder risk management. And what's been discussed has been around the identification and control of physical hazards mostly. There are very few examples, if any, about using participation in assessing and understanding exposure to psychosocial hazards. But what's really important is that this is actually critical, because psychosocial hazards aren't observable. It's not like we can actually see people when we're observing physical hazards, which is common. We can't do the same with psychosocial hazards. We have to ask people, and these need to be measured by asking people. So by very nature, we have to engage, have high levels of worker participation if we're going to identify and then effectively control psychosocial hazards. But here is the tricky issue around leadership. We need to educate managers and supervisors so that they really understand their pivotal role in the risk management process, and we need to educate them both in their role, but their role in psychosocial hazards in the development of musculoskeletal disorders, so they understand that this pathway, this other pathway, is not it is a real pathway and not something that is perhaps just in someone's head. And so they need to be trained in both the how to identify and then the what to do. And really these we need to reduce the mystery. So the psychosocial hazards are not complicated, and really they're very strongly linked with good management practices. And so training people to have good, strong leadership skills really is a good step towards managing psychosocial hazards. So it should be embedded in leadership training. So I talked about at the start this research to practice gap, and I really feel, and other colleagues that I talk with, that we have this large gap that we need to work out how we're going to cross to get this research evidence that we have out into practice, and providing appropriate tools and resources to managers and supervisors, or people that can get information to them, so that we can address this gap. So here at La Trobe, we've been working on for a number of years an approach to address this gap, because for all the reasons I've just talked about, that our current risk management strategies don't reflect contemporary research evidence. And so some of the barriers that we've identified is this very narrow focus on a subset of hazards, and usually the physical ones, and this propensity to focus on a single event or an object as the problem. And we know that, as I started this presentation, we say that we have a very long latency between these events and then something happening. And so there are many events and not just one. And this is certainly in an Australian context, in part driven by the compensation system, which requires you to identify which event caused your problem. And so this channels our focus to what may or may not be the right event. It may be completely irrelevant. And so it doesn't deal particularly well with this concept of multiple interacting agents, nor with that of psychosocial hazards. And so there is a number of barriers that we need to overcome. So our tool is a firm. It's a participative hazard identification and risk management toolkit. And what it does is it's evidence-based, as you would expect, coming from academic group. It manages risk from psychosocial and physical workplaces, and it really has a participative approach. So it involves the workers and key stakeholders. It really takes a standard risk management cycle, plan, do, act, and it provides support through resources and tools. And it provides benchmark data because it's based with a survey tool. It provides benchmark data to measure ongoing improvements in the workplace. And it looks like this. So there is a support to get people started, and what really drives the process through the risk management cycle is this risk management team, which is a small team with 5 or 6 people who are in the particular organisation that are using this toolkit. It may be the OHS manager, it may be it'll have a supervisor and a worker who's involved in the work that's being analysed and assessed. So then there's understanding what your issues are, because that's really important part of starting any process. And then this really key part about educating management and supervisors on why it matters, what's important, what is the gap in what we're actually currently doing. Because if they're not on board, it's not going to work. So 2 things: you need senior leadership on board, as we all know. If senior leadership aren't on board in an organisation for something, it's going to be very hard to get support to get that to work. And as I said, the central underpinning of the toolkit is a hazard and risk survey, which addresses, identifies, asks people about physical aspects of their work and psychosocial aspects of their work. And so that's the baseline measure. So the survey is rolled out. What this does is identifies what's the hazard and risk profile, and that's done by using those survey results in conjunction with employees to work out what are the key issues a development of risk controls with the risk management team, implementation and review. So very similar to a risk management cycle that many of us would be comfortable with. The difference being we're asking people using this survey, and we're addressing both physical and psychosocial hazards. So the survey, as I said, asks about the manual handling hazards, but it also asks about those pivotal groups of psychosocial hazards. So rewards, relationships with management, workload, relationships with colleagues, and a couple of questions around the physical environment. Our risk indicator is a pain and discomfort score. So we ask people in about 5 body areas how often they have pain and what's the severity in each region. And this is calculated to a score out of 60. And this gives a risk indicator. So I just, what happens then is that with the toolkit is that this will actually be correlated with the hazards identified in the survey. So what can happen is that workplaces can clearly see what are their top 10 issues that they need to address, and then work through those to create appropriate risk controls. Now, as part of the toolkit, at the 12-month period, you would resurvey to see what the impact's been. Now, we know that it often takes a while to actually see claims drop, so it's compensation costs drop. But what you're looking for is a change in that hazard profile to check in to see what you've done has actually worked. So there's some key points as I'm coming towards the end of this presentation to think about in workplaces, or, one of the challenges with these presentations, I don't know where you are, but in places where you're working or you're engaged with, are thinking about what organisational current policies and procedures, and do they reflect contemporary evidence? I think there's a really strong need to not step away from management of psychosocial hazards. So they're difficult, but not impossible, and they just need practice like anything else. We get better at doing things the more we do them. What's really critical here is leadership, and it's pivotal. So we need to have support in making changes happening. So leaders need to be educated and really understand the important role of psychosocial factors and physical ones, but mostly they understand the physical ones, but they need to be educated in the important role of psychosocial factors and then support the necessary changes that need to be made in workplaces. So thank you for listening, and I'll now take any questions. I just thought I'd better put up a kangaroo that's actually on my front lawn. It's not a great photo there. Sorry about the quality.
Yeah, that's neat. To our audience, if you have any questions at this time, please enter them into the question box on the GoToWebinar panel, and we will ask them out loud. A couple of questions that came in. Did you have a chance to look at the data of Iceland and New Zealand, those countries where there's a higher percentage of older workers? Wondering if they had higher reports of MSD claims.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And no, I don't. It would be I think, a very interesting thing to undertake. What we do anecdotally, having spent a little bit of time in Finland and Denmark, is that they tend to have they have some different approaches to work. And I think there was an expectation people will work for longer. and they do. But whether or not whether or not their injury rates go up, I don't know the answer to that, but it would be a very interesting thing to look at.
Can you talk a little more about the toolkit you mentioned? For instance, where can you find it? Is it an industry standard? And have you seen any studies of it in practice?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So we are just, we've been working on the development of that toolkit to address this practice gap over a number of years. So we did baseline work to assess what the need was. We've done a project on what the barriers are, and so now we're just and we've used a paper version of the survey, of the toolkit in some pilot studies, and we've developed an online version of that we're about to release now. We're just ironing out a few technical hitches. And so that will be available to workplaces to use. We've run training here in Melbourne. We've run some pilot training in March. So the online version of that is new, hot off the press, or just about. The paper version we've been working with for a year or two. But as you can imagine, that's quite hard to disseminate to workplaces. Mm-hmm. So we have some reports online that talk about the development of that toolkit, and we have a report that is not available due to sitting with the regulator. That is not available online, which outlines our implementation project. So the answer is there is material around the development of the tool, but not on the use of it in industry. But if people are interested in using it, my email address is there, and they can email me and we can send through some details. I'm very happy to for people to contact, and we can send them the web link when it's available.
Great. I think that's all the questions for now. Dr. Oakman, is there anything you'd like to add following your presentation?
No, I'd just like to say, thank you to everyone for attending. And if there are any other questions afterwards, I'm very happy for them to contact you or contact me.